I want to thank everyone for coming once again. This is our second night of a full week of presentations. We had Svet Jacqueline yesterday. That video will be up on our YouTube site by tomorrow, Jay tells me. Tonight we have Heathcliff O'Malley. Tomorrow we have Daria Sovolova, Paula Bronstein on Thursday, Wolfgang Schim on Thursday as well. And Friday we finish off with Pulitzer Prize winning photographer Carol Guzzi on Friday. So it's really a great lineup. I appreciate everyone coming in. As always, we'll thank our sponsors, which is Pro Photo Daily, American Photographer, Photo Shelter, Archive Magazine, and Epson. So this interview with Heathcliff was recorded last week because he is in Ukraine and we weren't sure where he was going to be in logistics. So we recorded it previously, and we'll run it now, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. So Jay, hit the button. Heathcliff, I'm thrilled that you're here for us today, and I appreciate you coming back for a second time. And like we just said off the air there, that this is probably not going anywhere anytime soon, this war, and so you always have a standing invitation with us. And with that, it's all yours, Heathcliff.
Well, thank you for having me again. I genuinely wish that you weren't still, that the war wasn't still going on, We're almost a year now, and the mind boggles, really, that we are where we are. It was, I think, as during the days before the war began, I was of that sort of, I couldn't believe it would happen.
Right.
Which was probably the wrong mindset, but and now I can't believe that it's still happening. So, yeah.
And when did you come? When was the last time you were there, and when did you come out, Heathcliff?
So I went back in October, and so I did about 6 weeks. So I arrived mid-October, covered October and November, and then came back in early December. So Kherson became the big story, the city that none of us thought would fall before Christmas. And so I'll be talking a bit about that today, and some of the other things I did whilst I was there as well. And as you know, I like to look at a bit about sort of daily life as well, everything else that goes on during a war, which I think says a lot about the resilience of people and humankind in general.
Right.
So I thought I'd start with, so this is a picture that I took in May at the end of my second trip of Jana, who I met in Irpin, and she was cooking borscht. Her apartment block had been badly damaged. And so when I got back in October, the first thing I wanted to do was look her up and to see what was going on. And I got back to where the apartment blocks were, and as I came in, I saw this guy fixing his windows on the floor above, and we got chatting, and it turned out that Jana was now living on the other side of the corridor. And winter was coming, so people were getting worried about lack of electricity or a lot of power cuts, a lot of broken windows. And if you look across, and you can see a lot of the other apartments are completely uninhabitable, and it's I guess in the States or in the UK, in a block like that you wouldn't allow anyone to live at all, but a lot of these people don't have a choice. So he's repairing his windows. I did write a lot of this down, but I haven't got his name on here, I'm afraid. So opposite, here was Jana with her daughter Ira. She'd moved into another block. Life was still tough. She was earning, it was, I can't even remember how much it was now, but it was something like $10 a week, working in a local supermarket. Really struggling. She'd moved into this other apartment with her daughter and her partner. Broken windows, couldn't afford to get them repaired, was just feeling pretty upset about the whole situation.
Yeah, and Heathcliff, I mean, are there people managing these buildings? I mean, like when you say fix the windows, is there someone to actually go to fix windows these days?
Well, Jana would say that the people up the road in the newer blocks were getting things done, but where they were living, because so many of the blocks were condemned, that they were being sort of neglected, that nobody was coming to see them. But maybe they thought they were a lost cause and that they shouldn't really be still living in that area. I don't know.
Wow.
But, for them, it's a struggle. And they're still, like a lot of people, I wouldn't say completely dependent on food aid, but food aid makes a huge difference. And so here you have Jana again with her daughter, and she's collecting some food aid. There's lots of NGOs around who are doing this on the, because this is the outskirts of Kiev, so the logistics are a lot easier than they might be closer to the front line.
And how long
So
did
there
you
are
get to
people
stay
out
with
there.
them?
So
How long did you get to stay with them?
So I spent about an hour and a half, and then we went off and did a few and had another look around Irpin, and then we came back and we had some dinner with them, which was lovely. It's just, it's good to catch up and
Yeah.
and just see how their lives are progressing. And next time I go, I'll go back again, and I'm hoping I won't find her there. And somebody will
Right.
say, "Oh, Jana's gone. She's in an apartment elsewhere," and
Right.
that would be the ideal situation. But who knows?
Right.
Totally different. So we're still in Kiev, and it's probably not what you expect to see, but
Right.
it kind of reminded me of my youth, really. And I have to say the hairs on the back of my neck stood up a bit. But there was a charity organized, so this warehouse party organized by they're called Civic Ukraine. It's an all female volunteer organization. And they got some sort of superstar DJs together, and they arranged this warehouse party in an old warehouse in the Podol district of Kiev. And the money made on the ticket sales were basically going to the war effort, so to buy supplies for soldiers. And it's a weird thing. It's kind of not what you expect to see, really. But then I can imagine, in London during the Blitz in World War II, people were still going partying and getting on with stuff and having, letting their hair down, and this was for a good cause.
It's part of the human condition, right, Heathcliff?
Yeah. I mean, you have to live, because otherwise, what's the point in fighting if you can't live? That's what you're fighting for.
Yeah.
Just so people can live.
No, it's great you're showing that image. These images. That's wonderful.
So it might seem a bit sort of offbeat, but I find this other side incredibly interesting, because you just don't realize what's going on out there, and how people live in these sort of situations.
Yeah. Very compelling.
Then we were doing a story on, because of the when I arrived in Kiev, there'd just been those first Iranian drone strikes, and it was the beginning of this new policy to start attacking infrastructure in the major cities by the Russians. So they were attacking power stations, and also using these small drones and using swarms of them at a time. And I arrived just after that, and so we'd gone to do a story on how the hospitals were going to cope, how the health system would cope if there was a power cut. It turns out they've been pretty good in sourcing generators. So they've now got these huge generators the size of a truck, which they start up when there's a power cut. And anybody who's in emergency care, the Kiev health authorities say will be okay. That they'll have power. If you're in intensive care or on the operating table, they'll have power. And whilst we're there, they took us into a ward with some wounded soldiers. And whilst we're there, we came across this guy Serhi, who he'd had brain and spinal surgery, and amazingly was back up on his feet again. And after 2 months, and he's like, show me, how tough he was, and he's like, "We Ukrainian, we are undefeated," and it, I was just amazed at how his resolve to get well again, and just I think he symbolized the spirit of Ukrainians, really.
Yeah, that is their spirit. My God.
Yeah, I mean, just after that, I mean, I haven't put the picture in the show, but he lifted up the back of his shirt, and it's just his whole spine was just like this long line of stitches,
Really? Wow.
and yeah, just incredible. So after Kiev, we went down to Kryvyi Rih, which was an area I wanted to go to previously, and whilst the battle for Kherson was still going on, Kryvyi Rih was also the gateway to the villages in the Kherson region north of the city itself that had been liberated during the autumn offensive. So,
and who are you traveling with, Heathcliff?
So at this point, I'm with a reporter, Joe Barnes from the Telegraph, and our fixer, Eugene, who drives and fixes. I mean, I offer to drive as well, but I think, most drivers don't like being passengers. So we get to this stage where he kind of, even when it's a really long drive, he's like, "Oh, no, Heathcliff, don't drive." He thinks I'm too slow. I think he's too fast. And it's funny. So we ended up in one of the villages as Velika Alexandrivka, and the main bridge is destroyed out of the town. And as I'm arriving, there's this family just standing there looking out, and one of them's taking pictures with their phone, and the whole bridge is gone. There are smashed up cars down below, and quite a common scene. And we got talking to them, and they had left about a month to 2 months into Russian occupation. They'd managed to get out, and they'd escaped over this bridge before it was taken down. And this was their first day back. So for them, the bridge to them, symbolized their escape, and I guess was a bit of a sort of magnet that drew them back before going to see if their home was all right. I followed them back to their home afterwards, and that was fine. And we talked a bit about life under occupation. The daughter was a local journalist, and for her it had just been too dangerous for her to stay. And tough. People were going missing. It was scary at night, for a woman walking home, with Russian soldiers walking around drunk. The same sort of stories that you hear in many villages.
Yeah.
This is outside the local police station, just burnt out cars and Z markings on vehicles. I assume that this must have been a vehicle that maybe Russian soldiers had requisitioned at some point and marked with Z, and then had been disabled in strikes. This is one of the local schools, and there's a Ukrainian soldier outside doing pull-ups. It was quite funny because there was another photographer. After I'd taken his pictures, I was looking through somebody else's Instagram feed, and they had the same guy on another day doing exactly the same thing. And it's sort of weird, really, how you can end up sort of tracing somebody else's steps without even realizing it. So many schools have been used as bases by both sides, and as a result have ended up in a terrible state. And a lot of these schools were in really good shape beforehand, and I was quite impressed with the facilities that pretty small towns or large villages had, in terms of education. And now all of this is gone. It's going to cost billions just to restore these up once the war is finally over.
And do you have a sense that there's an infrastructure to rebuild, or that's going to be, put on NATO or the population to come back and build? Get us any sense of that?
Well, on the outskirts of Kiev, they seem to be rebuilding.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just homeowners that are doing the work, but when you get closer to the front line and to recently liberated towns and villages,
They're starting.
then you don't see as much. I mean, you might still see people like bizarrely sweeping streets, and they'll do a bit of cleaning up. But for instance, this is a hospital down the road. So this is in Visakopilia, which is another small town in the Kherson region, and the hospital's just gutted.
Mm.
And I just can't imagine. I'd imagine that it'd have to be knocked down.
Really?
And just
Wow.
all the equipment smashed up. I just can't see what they're going to be able to do. It's tragic, and these are the for a working for a functioning society, you need health and education. They're two incredibly vital parts of society, and this has all just been smashed up in this needless war.
Yeah.
Back in Kryvyi Rih itself, Kryvyi Rih is a mining town, and it was quite fortunate at the beginning of the war in the fact that because it's a mining town, they have these huge monster trucks that they use in these open pit mines, and they managed to block their roads and the runway to the local airport before the Russians came, and actually prevented
Mm.
the Russians landing. And basically, if the Russians had taken Kryvyi Rih, they could have gone right up the right bank of the Dnipro and surrounded Kiev, and things could have been very, very different.
Mm.
And this steel plant was kind of a sister plant to the one in Mariupol, where the Azov Brigade were fighting. And it's this huge complex with just one blast furnace still operating. And these are the kind of things that just need to keep going. Without once this when a blast furnace is turned off, it's very difficult to get them sort of up and running again.
Yeah.
And it just shows how for them, steel is vital. I mean, in the midst of a war.
Yeah.
And it was one of the reasons I wanted to go there, to see how industry was managing still to function.
And has it been sort of commandeered where they're only working for the war cause now, right? I mean, that seems obvious.
That's the thing, and is that they don't like to talk about what they're doing.
Oh, is that right?
I guess it was probably the same, for us back in the 40s or whatever. But
Yeah.
you find increasingly now that nobody really wants to talk. It's martial law.
Right.
They're fighting a war of it's an existential war, and nobody really likes to say exactly what they're doing, where the steel they're producing is going to go to. I don't think they're building tanks or anything like that at the moment. I think the main tank factory is up in Kharkiv. I'm pretty sure that's not up and running, but yeah, who knows?
Mm.
So we went back up to Saltivka in Kharkiv afterwards. Saltivka was badly hit northern suburb of Kharkiv in March, April. The Russians were pounding it on a daily basis. And when I was in Kharkiv in April, that was still going on. And I got as far as the train station and never managed to actually get inside to Saltivka. I guess it was just one of those places that I didn't feel particularly comfortable being there when the shells were raining down on the place, and never made it. And So it was good to go in and have a look afterwards.
Yeah.
On this trip, and just see who was left and the level of destruction. I mean, it was just beyond words, really, just how bad it was. And when you're just surrounded by this huge complex of apartment buildings, and they're just all destroyed, but barely anybody left. In fact, Svetlana here is probably, well, she was the only person we found who was still living in one of the apartments, and she took us up onto the roof.
Yeah, and can you tell, Heathcliff, by the time you get there, were there people living in there at that moment, or had they moved out knowing that
Well,
they were going to be targeted? You get any
well,
sense?
yeah, I mean, people were living in these blocks all the way through,
Really?
and it was only after the Russians had pushed back that the final inhabitants were asked to leave and shipped out. But she wouldn't go, and she'd been offered accommodation elsewhere by relatives, and just didn't want to leave. And I don't think I'd hesitate to say that I think her mental health was suffering, and it's one of the tragedies of war, that it's very difficult for people to cope. And imagine the stress of living in those sort of conditions, and now you're in a apartment block with no electricity. Some of them have gas, but it's getting cold, there's no heating, there's no water, and you're on your own in this
If the war doesn't, yeah,
sorry.
yeah. No, if the war doesn't make you crazy, the rest of it will.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it makes our troubles seem to pale in comparison, really. And then this is another apartment block. So this is in Izium, which is a large town in the same region, which became quite well known because they found well, there's a map. It's complicated, but they when they liberated Izium, they found the cemetery had been extended, and a lot of civilians have been buried there, and they found some smaller mass graves as well. And forensics are still going looking at those bodies and trying to determine who these people were and how they died. Some of the graves were marked, so that was what it became known for. But also, this is one of the apartment blocks that was badly smashed up, and this woman, who I haven't taken her name down again, I don't understand. I do have it somewhere, but she lived in this block, and by chance she wasn't there that day. But over 50 people died when it was hit by a missile strike. They were taking cover in the main atrium, where they, often, if you don't have a bomb shelter, there's like a safe area to an apartment block. In our hotel in Criveria, it was the same thing. You had it was meant to be like the most structurally sound part of the building in case anything happened. So all of the families had gathered in this one spot, and all been wiped out. And she was walking her dog along, and she said that every time now when she says, "Okay, let's go home," the dog wants to come back to this block.
Is that right?
Because he thinks it's still home, even though it isn't. And then we get to Kupiansk. No, sorry, this is still Izium. So this guy Oleg is staying with his grandmother and aunt, and he came back, I think, just before war broke out, and has stayed with them ever since, just offering support and helping them out. And as the winter was approaching, they were going to an old Russian base and gathering ammunition boxes to break up for firewood to try and get them through the winter. And this is just outside Izium, and we've got a former Russian base in a very small residential area off the main road. And one of the sort of I started using a drone on this trip, and even though this isn't an obvious drone shot, it just enabled me to sort of lift the perspective a bit in the image.
And is that new technology for you?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think this was like the second time I'd ever flown the thing, and I was still a bit, sort of shaky with it, but just trying to get different viewpoints,
Right.
which I think is becoming more and more important to do.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that the next frame, so this is directly opposite this burnt out tank.
Okay.
And this is Mikhail and Valentina, and they'd lived in this little hamlet. And they said that, in fact, the Russian soldiers didn't treat them particularly badly. They just kept themselves to themselves. But towards the end of the occupation, as the Russians are getting hit more and more, they arrested him and carted him off and took him away for questioning, I think overnight, because they thought that he might be spotting for the Ukrainians. So he had a bit of a scary time, and they were just coming back to see their home, which you can see behind them, had taken a few hits.
And how do they determine if somebody is a spotter or somebody is playing both sides? Is it
I don't know.
phone?
I really don't know. I think they're just suspicious of anybody if they see you on a phone. I know, for instance, one of our fixers' relatives had, they were quite nervous during occupation, because whenever if the Russians saw you with a phone standing around outside, they would often think you're up to something,
Sorry. Okay.
But lots of people get carted away and taken away for questioning, and all sorts of things have happened to them, as we found out in Kherson. Lots of people were quite brutally interrogated and tortured.
Yeah.
So back in Kharkiv, the prosecutor's office have been collecting all of the shell casings that were used on the likes of the Saltivka district of northern Kharkiv. So they've now got thousands of these shells, and they're collecting them as evidence for possible war crimes. Yeah, because the majority of these have rained down on civilians, and thousands of people have been killed and maimed by these, and it's just really quite shocking. And this is obviously another drone shot, and I just don't think if I use from ground level, it just would I just knew it wouldn't work. When I arrived there, I just thought this will be the chance to use the drone. But the funny thing was, when I set it up and I was trying to get it going, they have a GPS on them. It's meant to stop you from flying near airports, and at first it locked me out, and it wouldn't go even though the airport's not functioning. So you had this moment when I couldn't even take the picture, and in the end we managed to bypass that and get something. And this is the prosecutor's spokesman, standing amongst all of these shell casings. But when you're there, it's the being surrounded by all of this hardware that must have cost millions. I mean, I think I do have a figure somewhere. I mean, it was a crazy. It was like $100 million or something. Just a crazy amount of money that had been spent on maiming people and killing people.
The war machine is profitable.
Yeah. Just really quite shocking. And then this is Kupiansk, another town in the Kharkiv region, which had been liberated in the early autumn. And nothing really functions there, but they have this market. And I just, there are soldiers walking around buying food and families. And there's this farmer who's just selling meat on the bonnet of his larder, and then you've got the local dogs hanging around too. And it's just a scene of life, going on in Kupiansk.
Yep.
Still burnt out Russian vehicles at the side of the road, and people just trying to get on with life. We then headed back down towards the Kherson region again. And who do I have here? So this is Natalia, who'd been with sitting outside the front of our house with our husband Yuri when a Russian rocket landed on their home and destroyed it about 10 days before we arrived. And they were, trying to piece their life back together. So they'd already been liberated at this point. So this was a village called Trifonivka in the Kherson region, so north of Kherson city.
Yeah, and there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that people, the Russians aren't coming back either.
No, and
Right.
so you do get, as a result of that, you do get people who don't want to be photographed, and you get that of some soldiers as well who are a bit funny, and you get the sense that they're still pretty unsure. But she was clearly very upset, and interestingly, what she said is the further that the Russians move away, the more scared they are and the more dangerous it feels, because they said when they were closer, they could hear the Russians firing their artillery. So they knew to take cover. And as they get further away, they can't hear the outgoing anymore. So all they get is that whistle, which often is a second, It's, well, if it doesn't whistle at all, then it's probably just right on top of you, which has happened in that case. They were incredibly lucky that day. But it just makes you think that after liberation, the war still goes on for them. It's not over.
No.
This was not far down the road, just a crew member from a self-propelled gun. So this is like a sort of light artillery piece, I guess, light mobile artillery piece. And we got chatting to them. And on this day, this is the day when it looked like Kherson was about to fall. And he's looking, pretty happy. He'd just been pulled back from the front line to do some repairs on the vehicle. And it's just one of those, nice little moments. I didn't take names. I try not to with soldiers, really. I'm just, or sometimes they tell you a unit, and I don't even like publishing that in a caption, because I always find some of that just maybe just a little bit too much info,
Yep.
So the first couple of days when Kherson fell, it was very difficult to get any access. A few people managed to get in, and I take my hats off to them. Really incredibly resourceful, and a few TV crews got invited in on the first couple of days. And then after that, they invited journalists to go on a bus trip. And it's kind of the last thing you ever want to do, is get on a coach with, I think there were 3 coaches with sort of like 50 journalists in each of them. I mean, it really is. It's not, you don't feel like you're reporting when you queue up to get on a bus at sort of, I don't know, it was something like 6 a.m. in Mykolaiv, which is a city about an hour's drive away. And I don't know, I just had a feeling, and I remember I was saying to other people, I said, I think Zelensky's going to be there today. And they're like, oh, don't be stupid, because the city had only fallen a couple of days beforehand, and it was still pretty dangerous. The journey was pretty difficult. It took a lot longer. The main highway bridge had been blown up, and we had to take this detour through some villages. And we got off the bus outside the main state building in Kherson city, and it's right in the center of the city. And I could see some press gathered, and then I could just see Zelensky and his entourage walking towards us, and I sort of fought my way in. And he gave a speech, and he seemed very relaxed.
Well respected, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I kind of thought it might happen, but you still don't expect it. And I'd never photographed or met Zelensky before, so it was, it was a moment. And just as he was walking off, he turned back to somebody called out something, and one of the journalists called out, and he just turned around for that brief moment before he left. And whilst he was there, I mean, I can't photograph this, but whilst he was standing there and speaking to us for the sort of 5 minutes or whatever it was that he was there for, there was this constant rumble of artillery, most of it outgoing. I think they were probably suppressing the Russians, because you think that a kilometer from where he's standing there is the river. And then the river at that point is maybe, I don't know, half a kilometer wide, 500 meters wide. And on the other side of that are the Russians. So in reality, he's probably, you are on the front line in Kherson at that point. You're 2K from the Russians, and you're within mortar range. A heavy mortar, 120 mil mortar, will have a range of like 6K, maybe more. So yeah, he was in and out, but yeah, it was quite a moment. And there was flag waving and jubilation. The sky was blue, which most of the time makes us feel a little bit nervous if you're close to Russian forces. But it was a lovely day, and sort of surreal, because it didn't feel right. It was wonderful to see everybody celebrating, but you at the same time you kind of thought, well, how can this be? How can it be so quiet and peaceful, and everyone's walking around and everyone's happy?
Crazy.
Yeah. Second day, we went down and had a look at a police holding cell where it was alleged that there'd been some torture taking place, that Russians have been torturing locals. And we did interview one man who said he'd been in one of the cells and had been beaten up and tortured for a period of time because he was ex-military. Outside were just these kids who, I didn't, visually inside the compound, I didn't think was particularly visually compelling, but I just like this image of the kids standing outside who are sort of dressed up like they're at a checkpoint, and they've got plastic guns and yellow taped armbands on, and mimicking their liberators. And then down the road, people are starting to gather. The weather's changed. They've got no water. A lot of them they've got no electricity. The Russians destroyed everything on the way out. So as they were leaving, I can't remember what you call it. There's a phrase for it, isn't there? That sort of slash and burn thing.
Yeah.
But they destroyed all the power stations, and which means that the water pumps wouldn't work. And you start to think how people are going to cope, and everyone was gathering, hoping that some food aid would arrive, which did. And I think this was World Central Kitchen, who are a great NGO. So if anybody has ever got any loose change, they're worth looking up. They take donations. They seem to go to places that others don't. So the World Central Kitchen. And they provide meals. Great organization. And they were, hundreds of people were queuing up that day. And you could, sort of sense how, desperate people are starting to feel. And it's just an entire city that had lived under occupation, but relatively safely for most of them, if they kept their noses clean. It wasn't a happy life, but it was, they had a life.
Right.
A little bit offbeat again. So this is in Odessa. We'd find ourselves commuting a lot. Mykolaiv, which was the closest city to Kherson, there's only a few hotels, and you can Airbnb as well, bizarrely, but there wasn't really anywhere to stay. So we'd find ourselves going back to Odessa, which was like a 3-hour drive. So we'd end up doing 3 hours there, 3 hours back, and then staying over. And one morning just went and had a walk along the beachside, and you've got this bride posing for photos and freezing kids.
Life has to go on, right?
Yeah. And I just love you've got the beaches meant to be taped off and mined. You've got people sort of, playing with their kids. It was just, it's just bizarre scenes. Lots of power cuts, but they have these, once again, like in the hospital in Kiev and in surrounding areas, they have these generators on the street that try and provide some power. You're talking about infrastructure. This is during the blackout, and the refuse collection is still ongoing. I mean, we struggle sometimes, in the UK, just for people to collect the rubbish, and they're still managing it. I mean, it's kind of mundane, but at the same time, I just find it fascinating how things are still working there. When you're talking about, is there infrastructure, what happens, and they're still going for it. And we bought some tickets to the ballet, which might seem a strange thing to do, but afterwards I kind of kicked myself for not just going and shooting the ballet in Odessa, but a lot of people have done it before, and we just sat in one of the boxes, in the circle, and just watched, and just kind of had a night off, really. But what was strange was, before the ballet started, there was an announcement on the tannoy, and first of all it was in Ukrainian, and then it was in English, and it was along the lines of, we're very sorry that we are in the middle of a war, and if the sirens go off during this performance, we'd like you all to leave and take shelter, but to remind you that your tickets will be valid for an alternative performance if that happens. Which is, could you imagine that, sitting, going to the theatre or the cinema or whatever in the States or in Europe, and having that come over,
Unbelievable.
And that's the reality of it, because rockets and missiles do land in Odessa, and there were people sitting down and watching the ballet, and I literally just shot this from my seat.
And you mentioned mental health. How do how are you dealing with this? How do what's your mechanism to deal with this type of stress and this, the craziness of war?
Well, it is a stress, but I guess one of the ways that we were dealing with that was coming back to Odessa and not just sleeping on the floor somewhere, so you're mitigating it a bit. Yeah, I mean, it's stressful, and this was a long trip. I mean, I've got colleagues who spend longer than 6 weeks, but 6 weeks is a long time, and there is a stress to it. But I don't know. I think some of the more mundane pictures I've shown tonight, I think, just show that that humans deal with stuff. They manage to find they find a workaround. They adapt, and that's, I guess, why the human race is so successful, and why we still are where we are today.
It's a mental workaround, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And this is a quirky little story that these guys, they're a territorial defense unit who have, because I'm a contract photographer of the Telegraph, and one of our other teams has been in contact with these guys before, and they're from the Kherson region and from Crimea. And this parishioner, what's his name? So yeah, military chaplain Alexander Horuk had come down from Kiev looking for a priest that had gone missing. He'd seen some photos posted online. The Russians had taken the priest and forced him to say some stuff on a video in support of Russia, and he'd been very concerned about his welfare, and they were walking around with this photo on a phone trying to find out where he was. And at this point, they were standing outside his little chapel in Kherson city, asking locals where he was, and trying to find out where to go. In the end, they located him at one of the main churches, and took some photos with him. And it turned out that not only he'd been arrested by the Russians and accused of all sorts, that he'd also been transporting all the way through the occupation. He'd been driving people out at night, and helping them to escape occupation. So, there are so many heroes in
Yeah.
in these in this war, like others, and he's one of them. And he, throughout, and he was very lucky to get away with his life. I mean, I still, the mind boggles why they finally let him go, but they did, and fortunately. So it's just one of these funny little stories. I mean, after that
Yeah.
we went off down the road, and they went to show us this site, this Russian base that had been hit by some HIMARS, and then we got had a few incoming rounds that were a little bit too close for comfort straight after us. It was one of those really crazy days. And then we went back with them and had some borscht, and
Of course you would.
and it was just one of those really crazy days. And following day, we'd gone back to the that detention center again to follow up on the whole torture story and the war crimes story. But we it got very noisy. There was a lot of incoming artillery that morning, and we took cover for a bit. We were with the police, and they, we just stayed down in the basement of that detention center. And as soon as there was I think maybe for about 40 minutes to an hour, we couldn't really move anywhere. It was pretty intense. It was probably the worst day I'd seen so far in terms of artillery, Russian artillery. It's definitely ramping up. And as we came out, we'd got into the car and we're trying to get out of the area, and we just saw that there was somebody by the side of the road, and then these soldiers came along and gathered and put tourniquets on him. I didn't get his name. There was one of those moments where you sort of felt that you needed to record what was going on, but also that we were still in the danger zone. This is quite wide open land. There's like some parkland to the left of him, and I think this is University Street. And yeah, it's just one of those areas you really don't want to stand around for too long. But it just shows that 1 minute it's always people that it's so much of the time it's just innocent civilians who are just walking. They don't have a car. They're in the open. Who knows where they were going? They could have been walking to the post office to try and pick up their pension, or they could have been going to the shops or going to the pharmacy to pick up some medicines. I don't know his story, sadly, because we didn't, like I said, we didn't stay around for too long. But it just puts things into perspective that 1 minute you're just up and it gets noisy. You think, oh yeah, you take cover and you feel a bit silly. You're there, you're lying on the floor.
And they
Wondering
took
when
his
it's all going to
shoes
be
off,
over.
huh?
But then you realise that this is the reality of it. I mean, his legs are shredded. It's just awful.
And they took his shoes off, huh?
Yeah. I mean, his feet were just in an absolute mess.
Yeah.
But at that point, Kherson, it felt like the story wasn't really developing, and you can stay in one place, and sometimes that's the best way to get the stories. But every day on the drive from Mykolaiv to Kherson, we were passing this village called Posad Pokrovsk, which had been the frontline village from the Mykolaiv front. So you had different fronts. You had a front line coming from the north, from the Kryvyi Rih, heading southwards towards Kherson, and then from the west of Kherson, from Mykolaiv, you had another front pushing in. And this had been the front line. So in April, this was like one of the villages we couldn't go to. We were in another village called Shevchenkova, and then there was Luch, and then this was the final frontline village. And this is where the Ukrainian soldiers were mostly. This was, and as you drive along the road, you just see smashed up houses either side of the road on the highway into Kherson. And we just thought it'd be a good idea to go in and just see if we could find anybody that had stayed, anyone at all that had stayed in what just looked like Armageddon. It's just unreal. And we hunted around and we found these two. and it was just crazy. So this is Valeri and Nadia. I think they've got a bit of a complicated story, but they've been together before and broken up, and they lived in houses opposite each other. And sometime during the fighting, her house was flattened by a Russian shell. And Valeri's like, come stay with me. And then their relation, their love for each other was rekindled. And they were seriously, we hunted around everywhere and we found people repairing their homes. And we were like, look, did anybody stay here at all? I said, no. You'd have had to have been crazy to stay here.
Really?
Only people who were here were the soldiers, but then there were these two. And they stayed there the entire time. And they passed the time by building jigsaw puzzles. So they had all of these jigsaw puzzles. But you can see, I mean, these are sort of large caliber rounds in the wall of their kitchen, their place was, I mean, it was like a sieve, it was so perforated by bullet holes and shrapnel, and they somehow they'd managed to stay. And I just thought it was incredible. I mean, one could possibly argue that they weren't playing with a full deck of cards, if you know what I mean. But
yeah.
Sandwich short of a picnic. But hey, I mean, it's war, and just incredible. And you can just see the way they're looking at each other.
Yeah. So charming. But
yeah, just love it.
And that's what so much of your imagery does. It just brings us the normalcy of the craziness of war.
Yeah, I find human nature quite fascinating, really. I mean, I've been covering conflicts for quite a while now, since the late 90s, and it's not the war, it's the people, it's people are just incredible, and just how they deal with things.
Yeah, no, it's true.
So we went back up to the north again. The snow had started to fall, and we thought we'd got to go back up north. This is the early snow. This is the first sort of cold snap. And we went back up to Saltivka, and Svetlana's still there. This day she's like, go away. I mean, she didn't even recognize us, so we just left her alone, but she's there all alone in her apartment block. I mean, who knows how she's surviving? I mean, it's just incredibly sad. And we went back to, I think this is Kupiansk again. Just trying to find this family name. So Kasemia, this little girl. So I'm just trying to find the order of these. Right, so it should actually be this way around. So we come across this family, and they're queuing up at a soup kitchen, and things are pretty tough for them. There's the mother, who's I don't think Victoria. It was her husband Vladislav, and they've got the two children. This is Kasemia down there next to her in a little peach-colored hat.
Yep.
And they're just going to the soup kitchen to collect some food. Their apartment block is got huge holes in the roof. I'm not too sure if it was from the fighting or not. I imagine so, because most things are fairly intact before. I mean, this is one of these kind of Rust Belt towns that over the years has seen industry fall by the wayside. They're struggling with it was explained to me that a lot of the industries were owned by Russian oligarchs, and as time went on after 2014, that more and more pressure was put upon them to wind down their operations in Ukraine as part of the trying to impoverish the people there. This is how it was explained to me. I don't know how true that is, but this is what was told to me. So I think there's unemployment's probably pretty high, but they're so we met this family, and then they said, just follow us back. and I found myself playing. We call it Peebo. Is it Peebo in America when you like with kids? And Peebo,
Peekaboo. Peekaboo.
yeah, and so as Eugene was driving, I was playing this game of Casemia, and we're passing this blown out bridge, and I'm taking pictures, and for her it's just like this great bit of fun.
Yeah.
Um,
She found the playmate.
yeah, and then we got to their home, and yeah, so it's just a portrait of a family really, but I think she's it was just nice to spend a bit of time with them. And I think for her, I mean, clearly not in this picture, but before, she was just having a lot of fun, at the back of the car. And you just kind of think, well, a few minutes of fun and all the misery, why not?
Yeah, the one thing that you capture beautifully is how the Ukrainian people keep their dignity, no matter what the situation is on the food lines or getting water somewhere. They always carry themselves with a class and a dignity. Very beautiful.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible. So it's towards the end now, so we're back down to Kherson again. So whilst we're up in the north, what we found at first, to try and explain, because we keep moving around, but we were trying to do the winter story. But what we realized was that there was, in some ways, no winter crisis. This might seem crazy, but I think Ukrainians are very proud, but they're also, for a lot of them, maybe not the hipsters in the big cities, but for a lot of people, I think they're tougher than we are.
Yeah.
And I think that they still live the kind of life that many of us don't anymore. That, for instance, we were having dinner with a family in Kherson, and the wife bakes bread and I bake bread. I've been baking tonight, and I was like, oh yeah, during COVID, I had to buy a 25-kilo bag of flour, and she just laughed at me and says, I've got 300 kilos downstairs, and they pickle food, they still use traditional methods that we've forgotten about. I mean, I guess it's like prepping nowadays, right? But to them, it's prepping is what they've always done.
I was just going to say, is that being so connected to still World War II and that struggle and the ongoing struggles with
I don't know.
with
I
the
think
Russians?
it's just a different way of living. It's
And when you say pressing, you mean pressing like your
I mean
clothes?
prepping.
Prepping. Okay.
Yeah, like preppers.
Yeah.
So people just prepare in a different way. They can, they're more likely to be able to fix their cars and to patch up their roofs and
Yeah.
to chop wood, and they won't admit to maybe struggling as much as they really are.
Yeah.
So when you go to speak to people, they don't want to admit that it's a struggle. So for the ones that even are struggling, they don't like to admit it. They're proud. And I was saying before, I mean, can't stress enough, this is an existential conflict. They have a choice. They either, if they accept Russian occupation, they're accepting a life of misery, of, as one family put it, who'd lived under the occupation, it was like living sort of back in the 90s again, just as the wall had come down, with inflated prices, nothing on the shelves, fear of speaking out, the risk of rape and murder and torture around every corner. And so you've either got that or you fight. And this is the choice that they have out there now.
Yeah.
And it's a very bleak choice. So yeah, people just so it's very difficult. You're trying to do this story, and you're saying to people, are you worried? You worried about the winter? No, winter comes every year. we're prepared. And
How
And-
much different is it? Yeah.
yeah, and so I was starting to run short of time, and we felt it was time to get back down to Kersal and just see how things had changed again. And coming back again, the streets were kind of empty now. There weren't. We thought we'd have another look at the hospitals. That was getting harder because the main hospital in town had been hit by a shell, and the children's hospital, who had been open to the media, were now saying we don't want anybody coming in and reporting, because they were understandably worried that if there were reports in the media that it would attract unwarranted attention from the Russians. And you have to respect those decisions when you've got a school, a hospital full of children, and the head of the hospital, their main concern are the patients. And so going back to Kherson was difficult. When you're reporting on a story, your job is to find something new or different, or something that's going to engage the reader. And it's very different to your own journey through. Like in Ukraine, it becomes quite personal. You're there. I don't think invested is the right word, but it just becomes sort of deeply personal to you as a journalist. You get to know the people, you get to love the people, you get to love the country, and every person you speak to is important. Every person's story is important, but that's not the way that news works. It just isn't. And so you find yourself moving around trying to find something else which will keep people engaged.
Right.
And we were struggling because we were back in Kherson again. Nothing had really changed since the last time we were there. You've got this guy here, Evgeny. He's 62. He had just been evacuated from the very front line, so he was right on the in one of the riverside homes. And you've got this CIMIC group, which is a civilian and military operation to evacuate civilians, and these Ukrainian soldiers were bringing him to the railway station for evacuation. And then that evening, we decided to go and look at the evacuation train, because the trains have started running again. And they've been running for a couple of weeks by this point, and we weren't too sure what we were going to find. And they changed things as well. I think in the first few days, everyone was just massing on the platforms, waiting to get on.
Right.
But now they were processing people and letting them on in dribs and drabs. And as we were walking down the platform, we passed this family. And so it's Andrei and Valeria with their father, Alexander. And we'd walked past them, and I was with a different reporter by this time, a guy called Ben Farmer, who I'd known for a good couple of decades. And I said, I've got to go back. I need to photograph these people. And I doubled back, walked round, and I just nodded and lifted my camera, and they just looked up. And I took this frame, and then Alexander continued to sob on his son's shoulder. They were leaving on this train. They didn't want to, but they just felt that they couldn't stay any longer. The shelling had become so intense, but it was just too dangerous to stay. But that their father was just, he'd been sobbing. You can see in his eyes, you can see in all of their eyes the grief. When you think only a few weeks back, Zelensky had been there in the beautiful sunshine,
Right.
talking, the liberation of Kherson, and in such a short space of time that had turned to misery. And I don't think from my understanding from colleagues who are out there now, I don't think things are improving.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
It's just the city is slowly emptying, and this is the last image that
Yeah.
what I'd share tonight, and just heartbreaking, really. I mean, I moved around on the train and spoke to families and photographed kids who were kind of excited, and they were in their like Batman pajamas or whatever, getting ready for the night train. But I just thought that as an ending picture, this family and that just sense of loss,
Yeah. No, that says a lot. And like I say, you give us that other side of the kids in their Batman pajamas. It's you can see that as well. So what's next for you, Heathcliff? When do you go back? Are you thinking about going back?
So I haven't.
You could stop sharing if you like.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, it's up here, isn't it? If I can find the I don't know how to do it actually.
If
I
Jay
can't
is
see the mouse. Yeah, I don't know. Stop share.
there, you
Yeah.
go.
So yeah, I don't know when that's going to be. It could be in the next few months. I mean, we had some time out where we didn't have anyone over the Christmas period. So up until about a week ago, I was the last photographer we had out there. So I don't know when I'm going to be rotating in next. Is the honest answer.
And you're shooting for the
It
Telegraph?
depends. I mean, I probably would go back, but there is that sense. I mean, just like with Curse On, I didn't really, on those last few days we were there, and we'd overnighted that night before. The night of the train station, we overnighted that night, and there was just shelling all night, and it's a lot of risk, and we didn't really get a story out of it. So in the end, that last picture became, the journalist Ben had to write something to go with the picture, but we were going to leave because we just didn't have a story. So the story just ended up being that one picture of people leaving. But it's you to go back again. You kind of need you need
A hook, right?
you need you need a hook. You need something to write about and to shoot. And because otherwise, I mean, you can go back and you can spend another month there, and but unless you're engaged, unless you're engaging your editors with stuff that they think's worthy of publishing, you're kind of wasting your time otherwise.
Yep.
And it's terrible when you speak to people and you interview them and you take their pictures and they open up to you, and then those images never get seen, because it does happen. Not everything I shoot gets published.
Is that an indication of the audience as much as it is the publications? I mean, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is the public now not as interested in these human nature, human interest stories? What is it?
It's difficult to say because I can't put myself in anyone else's shoes. I don't know what the metrics are.
Right.
I hear of people talking about war fatigue. I don't know if it's true. I know for me, I just keep, every day I'm reading up about, what's going on, and where the front line is, and looking at pictures and reading stories in different papers and whatever. But that's because the story is personal to me, so I don't know. I think that it still gets incredibly good coverage everywhere, but it's incredibly expensive to cover the story. That's the other thing we got to think about is, at my paper, we're pretty fortunate. We've, they've managed to turn the business around where a lot of news organizations are struggling now. Some haven't managed to make the internet work. I mean, you've seen it in the States as well. Lots of newspapers. I remember 20 years ago, and the amount of American newspapers that would be covering a story, you know,
Yeah. Forget
and
it.
they're just not there anymore.
Yeah.
You get a few, you might see, bump into, you always see the New York Times, but, and possibly the LA Times, and, Washington Post, but that's about it. Don't see the Chicago Tribune or the
Right.
Dallas Morning News really anymore on these stories, or some of the others, or the US agencies. It's a different environment,
Right.
and it costs tens of thousands of dollars, these trips,
Yeah.
and you've got to it sounds terribly mercenary, and I don't mean it to sound like that, but these are you have to think about the cost of things,
Right.
and making sure that get that they're getting something out of it, I guess. I mean, we've been great. We've been we've been pretty much round the clock. Apart from this Christmas, we've been round the clock. We've had teams there the whole time.
Right.
Our paper has a podcast that runs 5 days a week, has done since the war broke out. And so they've been keeping up the pressure. I think, Britain in general has been incredibly supportive. The
Right.
government's been very supportive, like the US has. They're standing firm, which is great. So, but for me, I think as a journalist, you need to have a big enough a break away from a story to be able to cover the story properly.
Right.
Does that make sense? So when you
Yeah.
go
No.
back, you're seeing something new,
Yeah.
because otherwise, because you do find yourself in a situation where you go back somewhere that you've been to a few weeks beforehand, and you go back and you're like, well, I've just driven 6 hours and nothing really looks different here.
Right.
And whilst a fresh team will be like, oh, well, they haven't seen this before,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they might find something that you
Was under your
don't.
nose. But yeah.
Yeah,
But
because you're fatigued with it.
yeah. No, I get that. That's one of the things that I've learned myself with the way you guys go in and out, in and out. Like I would never feel like I would want to leave, but you
Yeah,
have to leave. You have to leave for a variety of the reasons you're speaking about, and many others, just for state of mind, right? I mean, you have to get out.
yeah,
Uh, it's just so intense. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate you doing this and recording with me earlier. So that's really wonderful. And Heathcliff, you have a standing invitation. And unfortunately I think we're going to see you again because this war doesn't seem like it's ending anytime soon, which is really a very 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 sad commentary for all people involved,
yeah, yeah.
especially those.
I when we were talking before you came on, just I can't see really how this is going to end anytime soon. I don't think Ukraine can win without escalating,
Yeah,
and escalation, what does that mean? Where's that going to end up? And
that's a scary word.
kind of, yeah, I mean, I kind of feel now that we're on this, on one of those, what do you call them? Not the, like, the fairground rides, but
Ferris
where
wheel,
you stop, you know.
the Ferris wheel,
Well, no, not the
or
Ferris
the
wheel,
roller
like
coaster. The roller coaster. Oh,
yeah,
that's
on this roller coaster that, that's just, the brakes don't work and you're just carrying on, but
yeah.
you
No,
kind of feel that you've got no choice, because I don't think, well, the Ukrainians certainly don't have a choice. I guess we have a choice, but I think at the moment we're making the right decision
yeah,
to support them, but it does sort of feel that that it's not ending up anywhere good
yeah.
in
That's
anytime soon. It's
so.
terribly sad.
Yeah. So again, I thank you. I give you the last word, Heathcliff, and we only ask you to be safe.
Thank you, and yeah, thank you for having me again.
The second time around is as powerful as the first. Um, so yeah, that was Heathcliff O'Malley. We can open it up. Anyone has any comments? Jay is going to put in the chat room Jason's connection there that we wanted to let everyone know about. You could put that in there, Jay. And there was also the mention of the World Central Kitchen by Heathcliff. So if anyone wants to look into that, I'm not advocating, any of those things. Just, if you want to do something, there are a variety of places to do something. I will say that I will try to find a way to use the term sandwich short of a picnic. That was really, really, I mean, I've never heard that term, but my family is going to be very, very sad that I picked up on that term. Because but it's another terrific presentation. Hey, Glenn, that it is just so important, what these photojournalists are doing.
For sure.
If anyone has a comment they want to add, we're going to be here, for the rest of the week with other terrific presenters coming on. As I mentioned before, we're going to have Dara Slavkova, Paula Bronstein, Wolfgang Schwamm, and Carol Guzzi will be on Friday. So it's it's a whole week of this information gathering, and I do really start to appreciate these behind the scenes kind of stories that everyone's been giving to give us a sense of the day in and day out life of these folks, and the incredible stamina of the Ukrainian people to have some type of order within this entire mess. It's really an interesting phenomenon. No one has touched, at least early on this week, about their love for their pets. But in these 30 or so other presentations that we've done, the pets are such an incredibly important part of their social happenings, and they would never leave their pet behind, and they'll taking other pets even in the middle of this entire mess. So it's very interesting. But like I said, if anyone wants to chime in with a question or a comment, that would be great. I'm glad that we didn't get bombed this evening like we did yesterday. But that's Jay on the bomb police.
I had a comment. I found it interesting compared to last night. I know I haven't seen too many of these, but so I'm sure that obviously there's many different approaches, but the different approach between the two, in the sense of the in-depth reporting or getting that close to families and so on, versus the the pressure of being on staff for a newspaper, and then basically feeling like they have to get the kind of go out and sort of search out stories, but then not necessarily do it in the same kind of in-depth way, in the sense of just kind of discovering as they go along. I just thought that was interesting, and I'm just wondering what you think about obviously the difference between those two.
Well, Jamie, why don't you chime in on that? Being a photojournalist yourself, what do you think of that? How you cover a story, or does the story come to you?
But there's a big difference. I agree with that. When you have an assignment, you're given some parameters as to what you're going to be looking for. If you're a freelancer, you're pretty much on your own. You have the support. You don't have all the money behind you. But if you're a staffer, usually they send you with a writer, and the writer brings another skill set to the game. If you're on your own, like Svet, who was here yesterday, you're just flying by the skin of your teeth and hoping that you get something that has some weight. And in the environment we're living in, it's becoming more and more difficult to be a freelancer. I mean, I do assignments and I lose money a lot of the time. I mean, you do this because you're convinced of, the value of it, but you're never going to be in the black all the time. I mean, that's just not the way it works. And O'Malley was a fantastic presenter. I mean, just the level of empathy he had for the people he was photographing. But the fantastic presentation.
Yeah, that really would. Yeah, and that was his second time with us, so yeah, he's good, and he brings you things that are off the beaten path, which is what we want to see. But you just wonder, with the way things are going with publications and circulation and on and on and on, if there's value to that, and he has to put that into the equation of what you go out and shoot, especially if you're doing it on a freelance basis, which I'm sure for you, Jamie, you know that like breathing on it.
You can almost feel the pressure of his photo editors, though. In the sense of the sense of the value when he talked about the value of what he brings back and the cost, and you just sort of get that sense of the pressure of delivering versus the freedom, as you say, of the freelancer being able to kind of do the in-depth story. Going out every day, knowing the cost, and then what am I bringing back? And just searching, feeling that pressure. I don't know. I just sort of felt that pressure that.
Yeah, that is the right word. That is pressure, because like Jamie say, a lot of time you're shooting and someone doesn't want to buy it. You just lost 2 days, 2 weeks of hotels, airfares, food, and you're coming back, and the landlord said you still need to pay the rent, right? I mean, it's all that stuff. That's that's a very it's a compelling argument, and then you start to see why then maybe the freelancers don't cover this event or that event, because they know they can't sell it anywhere, and then we all lose because we're not seeing what's going on the ground, right? It's a vicious cycle. That's it's the economics of it is a whole other conversation.
The other thing is access too, right? I mean, if you've got the Telegraph behind you or the New York Times or whatever it is, I mean, you've got kind of access where obviously the freelancer doesn't have the same access, which is a huge thing, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's something. It's interesting that you bring that up, because today we already taped for Wolfgang, because he's actually in Ukraine, really in the woods somewhere. But he was saying that he, even if you are part of the Times or here or there, you have to wait online, so to speak, to get approval from the military to get in. It's not like the Times shows up and come right in. There's bureaucracy around that too, which is something you'll see. I mean, he spoke about it for a while today, and you'll hear that on Thursday. But I mean, you do have a little bit more weight, but you still have to wait, to get in.
I wonder. Go ahead. I wonder how much pressure, how much coercion the military or the local government has as far as what you can and cannot shoot. I mean, obviously, if you're in Russia and so on, I've been in places like that, and China and things like that, and you're watched and kind of coerced and moved around and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, it's an interesting point that he probably brings up.
Yeah, I mean, like you said earlier, Liam, you haven't been in on a lot of these, but one thing you learn is that the Ukrainian government wants these photographers there. They want the world to see this. That I mean, like you see, their leader everywhere. He recognizes the more that he's seen around the world, the allies are going to keep the money coming and keep the support, and because the public, like us, is saying, we have to help the Ukrainians. We have to. If they shut the journalist out, they're really doomed. I mean, there's a big part of the media is a huge part of the whole mechanism to keep our the Western allies' aid coming is all of this. So it's it's the dog chasing his tail there, but it's it couldn't be more important. And I have to say that's part of the small thing that we're doing here is to have this exposure so that people are still talking about it, so that we can support those people. It's the media is huge. I mean, don't think what's his name doesn't fly on planes all over the world to speak to the American Congress and the French and the German. He's doing that as part of, I got to do that to thank everyone and to continue begging for the continued help. So that is a someone who's going to write a book on that piece of it. How important it is for him to be out there doing it, with his wife. I mean, who gets Annie Leibovitz to come and do portraits of them in the middle of the war? I mean, that's not done because, a glamour project. That's done because Annie goes, then there's more attention. It's all part of that. And I don't say that in a bad way against Annie. I'm just saying I get why he has to do that. May not like it, but that's part of it, I think. Right? You agree with that, Jamie? What do you think?
They need all the help they can get. I mean, at this point, the more, like you say, the more exposure they get, the more people are more bound to cooperate and, tell the politicians, you need to bail these people out or they're going to get obliterated by Putin, because that's what's coming if they lose. And it's not looking good. I mean, they're fighting the fight, but it's not looking good. It's horrible what's happening to these poor people.
Yeah. So if anyone else has a comment, now would be the time. If not, and that's fine. We'll be up tomorrow at 7:00 with a live presentation with Daria Torlova, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate everyone coming in and being here. Tell a couple of your friends. The more people that see it, the more beneficial it is for everyone. So I thank everyone for coming in, and we'll see you tomorrow.